issue of separation of church and state here in the U.S. The Temple University American Civil Liberties Union and Temple Libertarians are student organizations that work together to open gateways of communication about these critical civil liberty issues that do need to be discussed. With this debate, we want to provide the audience an opportunity to hear opposing perspectives of the relationship between faith and government in the United States. And our debate will be moderated by Professor Mark Rader, and he's a member of the Beasley Law School faculty since 1984. He specializes in areas of constitutional law, comparative constitutional law, and torts, an award-winning author of numerous books and scholarly articles on a wide range of subjects. Professor Rader is often called on by the local and national media in the United States to comment on topics ranging from torts and insurance to issues surrounding the recent Supreme Court nominations and decisions. A frequent public speaker and panelist both nationally and internationally, he has also regularly published commentary in such periodicals as the National Law Review, the ABA Journal, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Professor Rader is a Yale Law graduate, where he was note editor for the Yale Law Review. Absolutely. I'd also like to introduce Ed Joyce, the president of the Delaware Valley Americans United. And Ed Joyce has been a chapter leader with the Americans United for Separation of Church and State since 2008. He was elected as the president of the Delaware Valley chapter of the Americans United in 2010. Through DVAU, Ed works to educate the public about the importance of maintaining a healthy separation between church and state issues and helps coordinate outreach efforts throughout the Delaware Valley. Prior to joining the AU, Ed was a research scientist with a PhD in geology, specializing in evolutionary paleontology. He has also served as an adjunct professor of earth sciences at the University of Houston and the University of St. Thomas. He's a knowledgeable speaker, focusing on many church-state issues, including the controversy surrounding science education in our public schools. And over here we have Janice Rail, the Vice President of the Delaware Valley Americans United. And Janice is a founder and Vice President of the Delaware Valley chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Mrs. Rail is a grassroots activist who has focused on various church-state separation issues throughout her life, going from the front lines of boardrooms of women's and LGBT rights groups and secular organizations. In addition to defending reproductive rights and religious liberties, Janice has also fought anti-science legislation, state-sponsored funding of religious ministries, and school vouchers. Residing in South Jersey with her spouse and two teenagers, Janice has led the Delaware Valley Americans United chapter since its founding in 2003. In addition to serving as Vice President of the DVAU, Janice is also a member of the National Advisory Council of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Mrs. Rail has said working to protect the wall of separation through Americans United allows her to spend time advocating for various political and social issues that fall under the church-state umbrella, including supporting public education by opposing school vouchers, encouraging science literacy, defending a woman's right to choose, and calling for passing of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act and repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act. Through DVAU, Mrs. Rail works to educate the public about the importance of church-state separation and ensuring religious liberty for all Americans. And now here's Michelle Montalvo, Vice President of the Temple Libertarians, to introduce our other participants.
Hi, everyone. Over here we have Mr. Charles Proctor. Mr. Proctor is the Senior Managing Partner of Proctor, Lindsay & Dixon in Chaddsford, Pennsylvania, as well as the President of Industrial Valley Abstract Company. He practices in the areas of residential and commercial real estate, business and corporate law, and estate planning and administration. Mr. Proctor is a graduate of Temple University, having received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and his Juris Doctor from Delaware Law School at Widener University. Mr. Proctor is also an adjunct professor for the Legal Education Institute of Widener University School of Law and has served as an expert witness in the Court of Common Pleas of Delaware County and Federal District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. He has made several presentations to the Montgomery County chapter of PREP and receives frequent requests to speak on title and real estate related issues. He is also an affiliated attorney with the Alliance Defense Fund, having attained Honor Corps status. Peg Luxick, who is here at the moment, and she will be arriving shortly. She is from the Center for American Heritage. She is one of the founding members. The Center for American Heritage is a nonprofit dedicated to restoring America's unique heritage. Initially through the use of one-day seminars named the American Heritage Academy, the center is dedicated to teaching political activists and interested citizens about America's history, the political process, and how to be an effective advocate for return to limited government. You can learn more about the center by visiting www.restoreheritage.org. The Center for American Heritage was founded by Peg. Peg is a graduate of Clarion University of Pennsylvania in special education and elementary education. She was awarded an honorary Doctor of Humanities degree by Stonehill College in Massachusetts. Peg has taught every level from preschool through college in both regular and special educational settings. In the early 1980s, Peg founded Mom's House, a program designed to help young women facing problem pregnancies with the support they needed to both choose life and complete their educations. The program was recognized by President Ronald Reagan, and as a result, Ms. Luxick was asked to serve the Reagan administration as an advisor to the President's Commission on Family. Continuing her efforts, Ms. Luxick founded the National Parents Commission, which worked to protect parental rights and family structure at both the state and federal levels. She also sat on the founding boards of the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference and the Pennsylvania Family Institute. She was instrumental in the passage of the law allowing homeschooling in Pennsylvania and was a leading national opponent of outcome-based education, a proposed restructuring of our schools. And she's here.
Just finished your introduction.
Ms. Luxick's political career began in 1990 when she ran for governor in the Republican primary against the endorsed Auditor General. She spent less than $46,000 and secured 46% of the vote. Her message has not changed since that time, a message of principled conservatism without apology or compromise. In 1994, Peg ran as an independent, receiving more votes than any independent in modern history. In 2010, Peg ran for the U.S. Senate, receiving over 150,000 votes based on her message.
Good time. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Roderick from the Law School, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's debate, which I hope will be, and trust will be, a vigorous exchange of views on the nature of church-state relations in our government. The issue of proper constitutional relationship between church and state has been on the political and on the judicial front burners in recent years. Politically, it's been on the front burner because of a new level of political activism within many religious groups around the country, especially evangelical Christians and Catholics. That activism has been stirred by a number of domestic political questions, including gay rights, abortion, public school curricula, and government support for religious education. There is little doubt today that religious political activity has played a significant role in a wide range of national, state, and local elections. Politicians have learned that they ignore religious political groups at their peril. There is also little doubt that religious lobbying has played an important role in shaping both federal and state legislative programs on a number of fronts. The constitutional issue of separation of church and state has been equally controversial in the courts in recent years. Constitutional questions lie just beneath the surface of the political and legislative developments that I just mentioned. And for the most part, they involve a variety of constitutional issues, principally arising from the First Amendment's guarantees under the Establishment Clause, which prohibits the establishment of religion, and its Free Exercise Clause, which guarantees the free exercise of religion. They also sometimes involve issues of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and equal protection. These constitutional issues have been the subject of great controversy and deep division on the Supreme Court for generations, but those conflicts have been fueled recently by changes in personnel in the court, which could potentially alter the landscape of the court's First Amendment free exercise and Establishment Clause decisions. The current court, known as the Roberts Court after Chief Justice Roberts, has issued relatively few freedom of religion decisions so far, and the ones that have come down have been cautious and relatively opaque. But commentators, I think, generally agree that the replacement of Justice O'Connor by Justice Alito in 2005 shifted the court's majority towards a more flexible, often referred to as accommodationist view of church-state constitutional relations. How that shift will be reflected in the substantive law is yet to be determined. These considerations make the topic for today's debate one of considerable import. As the nation gears for the 2012 presidential elections, the constitutional and political relationship between church and state arguably hangs in the balance. Today we are fortunate to have four very knowledgeable and articulate proponents for two sharply divergent views of the proper constitutional relationship between government and religion. We've heard their introductions already, so I won't repeat that. But what I will do is discuss what the format for today's event will be. It's as follows. Each side will have an opportunity to give a brief introduction. After that, I will ask a series of 6 questions. These questions were determined by the sponsors of this debate, the Temple University chapter of the ACLU and the Temple Libertarians. On each question, one side will receive an opportunity to give a response, followed by an opposing response from the other group, followed by short rebuttals from each group. There will be time limits for each response and rebuttal, which I will try to enforce. I've told all of the participants I didn't get a chance to tell Peg because she was en route, but I'm going to signal with a 1 when there's 1 minute left, and I'm going to signal time when we're done. So hopefully that'll keep us on schedule. But in any event, it should take about 10 minutes to cover each of the questions, and we will switch question by question which side gets to go first. So at the end, at the end of all of that, we hope we'll have some opportunity for questions from all of you, from the audience, that you can direct to the individual participants. So in any event, we're going to start, and I believe that we're going to begin with an introduction from the representatives of Americans United.
Thank you. Good evening. During his presidency, then President George W. Bush called for an end to division in America, saying, "We have one country, one constitution, and one future that binds us." Although I agree with some of what he says, I don't agree with everything. Yes, there's one set of national boundaries. Yes, there's one document called the Constitution, but it's a stretch to say that everybody agrees with the present-day interpretation of the Constitution. I see the Constitution as a secular document guaranteeing religious and philosophical rights for everyone. Its First Amendment creates a separation between church and state. Its Article 6 reinforces the non-religious nature of our government by banning religious qualifications for public office. The Constitution itself was written to ensure minority rights are not threatened by majority rule. The other side reads the same document and somehow walks away concluding that the United States was founded to be a Christian nation. To them, separation of church and state is a modern-day myth invented by the Supreme Court. I look at the long line of church-state cases handed down by the Supreme Court, and while I don't agree with many of them, a lot of them are right on. Mandatory religious exercises have been removed from public schools. Direct government aid to religion has been banned. All religions, Christian and non-Christian, have been placed on equal footing. The other side reads these same rulings and shudders. To them, our public schools are the godless laboratories of secular humanism. Government's failure to subsidize religion is discrimination, they claim. Legally equating other religions with Christianity is blasphemy. I read the writings of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and feel immense gratitude for their wisdom. The other side reads those founders' words and either twists them beyond recognition or they mock them openly. That side feels threatened by the presence of other religions in America. They denigrate our multi-faith society as a politically correct nightmare that has suppressed America's true Christian origins. and the divisions that go on. I want evolution taught in our public schools. They want creation science. I want our public school systems to be supported. They want to shut them down. I support a woman's right to very private reproductive choices and support personal choices of who one chooses to marry. They invoke the Bible to dictate how a woman may decide reproductive choices, and they would like to tell people who they should and should not marry. I see a nation with a healthy religious diversity made up of Jews, Buddhists, Christians, atheists, and many minor sects. They see a Christian nation which is at best tolerant of other religions. I see a U.S. legal system with a long tradition of legal thinking, drawing from the Magna Carta right up to English common law. They see the Ten Commandments as the basis of American law. Yes, we live in one America, we inhabit the same land mass, but we're not in agreement on these issues. The American society we hold dear and the values it embodies are too precious to cede to the religious right. We have an obligation, not just for ourselves, but for future generations, to keep those values alive. The fact is, the American people have never voted to trash the separation of church and state. In fact, polls show that in general, people support the broad concept of church-state separation. Former President Bush said we have one future. Not so. Our future is in our control, and we face a choice. We can choose a path where religious dogma takes the place of American constitutional values, or we can choose to work to have a nation where moral choice is respected and where the rich religious diversity of America is honored.
Good evening. First, I want to thank everyone for coming out at somewhat unusual time, 5 to 7 o'clock. Frankly, this morning I just found out that this event was at 5 o'clock, so it was only fortunate that I was on time, and Peg, her lateness, please excuse her. We just had a little miscommunication on our side. I'd like to start out by saying something that I think you can all agree with. And that is, the Constitution guarantees every one of us the right to speak our piece, to say what we think, what we believe, and in turn to act on what we believe. The one thing I disagree with my friend is this. In his opening remarks, he put a lot of concepts, ideas, what we think, what we believe on our side of the podium, what our goals are, into your heads. I'd like you to take all that out of your mind right now, because he's never spoken to me, and he doesn't know what I think or what I believe or what I'm about. And to make a broad characterization of the religious right, believing this or believing that, is a dangerous way to go. I'm going to start out with a very good example. And Professor, you back me up on this if you can. Every major area of our jurisprudence in this country has a foundation in the Bible. I have read the Bible front to back several times. You name the area of law, criminal, civil, you name it, the foundations are there. Now obviously, we have changed a lot of things, we've modified it, we've made it fit our society today. I'll use that term rather loosely. But the foundations, it could be bankruptcy, it could be divorce, it could be murder, it doesn't matter. They're all in the Bible. You cannot deny that fact. Secondly, we have a Constitution, we have a Bible that's the best-selling book in the history of the world. More copies printed than any other document. But we have another document that right now is this thin, and that's the Constitution of the United States. I carry this with me everywhere. This is also the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, and you see how big it is. Our founding fathers deliberately made this a simple document. And the First Amendment says that Congress, the Senate, the executive branch, the judicial branch, that government shall not, what? Establishment. They shall not establish a religion. Doesn't mean they can't support it, doesn't mean they can't encourage it, doesn't mean they can't whatever. It's just they won't establish the government. We all know of many governments in the world today that are very church-oriented, very almost driven or controlled by their relationship with the church. And I don't care what church it is, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, they have a lot of influence there. The challenge that we have today, and I think will come out in the questions, is that our founding fathers, almost without exception, believed in God, believed in His divine providence in establishing this country and said so. The fact of the matter is that today, when the Congress, and although they're on recess, I think, today, the Congress and the Senate, when they open up their sessions, what do? They open it up with prayer. And they open it up with prayer because that is something we've been doing since the beginning of this country. My last point, before I close my opening remarks, is this. Within that Constitution is a framework for amending or repealing any law, any part of it that we don't like. Whether it's, if you think back, Prohibition in the 1920s, it got repealed. The Civil Rights Act got added. Voting for women got added. But there's a process for that, and that process takes a good deal of effort on the part of Congress, the Senate, and the individual states. It doesn't say that a court can modify a law. It doesn't say that a court can modify the Constitution. It says that we have to go through that process. And the process would be, if we were to change this, let's have a constitutional amendment that takes away the First Amendment. And if you've read it, it's one sentence. It's one very, very brief sentence. One that most people have not read thoroughly. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. An establishment, meaning a church-governed state. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There is nothing, I don't know of anyone on my side of the podium that would be opposed to the practice of any religion you can name. If you want to practice it, be my guest. Got my time. I'll be back. Thank you.
Okay, folks, the first question that's going to be addressed to both sides is, what is the separation of church and state, and where did this term come from? We're going to begin with the Heritage Group.
It's interesting when you look back through history. The words separation of church and state really weren't anywhere in any legal documents. We hear an awful lot about Thomas Jefferson's letter, that's where it came from. Thomas Jefferson wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. Did you ever wonder why he wrote that letter? I mean, he was the sitting president of the United States. He didn't get up one morning and say, I think I'll write the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut a letter. Why did he write the letter? He wrote the letter because they wrote to him. What did they say when they wrote to him? His letter was a response. What did they say? They wrote and said, congratulations on being president. Obviously, they said it more formally than I'm saying it. Congratulations on being president. We're so glad you're here because you are a proponent for religious liberty. And we have state magistrates who are attempting to take away our rights to religious liberty, to worship and express in the public marketplace what we believe as we believe it. And we're appealing to you, because we know what a proponent of religious liberty you are, to help us. So he wrote back. And in what he wrote back, he said government's authority should apply to actions and not opinions. He said the rights to conscience are natural rights. And he quoted the First Amendment. At the end of the quote, saying Congress cannot establish a state religion, nor can it do anything to prohibit the free expression thereof. The First Amendment is what creates that separation. Now, interestingly, what most people don't know is that Jefferson attended church in Washington, and 3 days after he wrote that letter, he attended church in Washington. His church was held in the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives. That's where they met. Thomas Jefferson attended there, and he didn't really like the music, so he had the Marine Corps band come in and play for them. Obviously, he didn't think that that was violating separation of church and state. He wrote the letter, and then he did it. Interestingly, though, however you interpret that letter, it's a private letter. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of private letters. Private letters have no force of law. The force of law is free expression. The words separation of church and state do not appear in any legal document that was written by any member of our founding fathers, ever. And if they're not in a legal document, they're not legal.
Response?
Hi, everybody. Americans have had more religious freedom than any people in world history. And we can choose what to believe, what to teach our children, how, when, and where to worship, which causes to give money to, or even whether we want to get involved with religion at all. We have separation of church and state to thank for this broadly based freedom. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The U.S. Supreme Court has determined that this clause is interpreted to mean that religion and government must stay separate for the benefit of both religion and government. The government holds no religious viewpoint and leaves all decisions about faith and religious practices to the citizens. Church-state separation has worked very well in practice. Americans freely support an array of houses of worship and other religious institutions. Our nation is religiously diverse, and many faiths exist side by side with remarkably little sectarian conflict. Our government treats people of all faiths, and none at all, equally. When our nation's founders separated religion and government, it was a revolutionary experiment. And this experiment has been an extraordinary success. It's made us the envy of the world, and Americans United wants to ensure that this wise policy continues. My opponent said that separation of church and state does not appear in the Constitution. I would like to point out that neither does the words electoral college, but we understand that Article 12 covers how we choose a president. We also understand that the First Amendment to the Constitution covers keeping religion and government separate. Church-state separation was first noted by the Supreme Court in an 1878 opinion by Chief Justice Morris Waite. It was later affirmed in the decision Everson versus Board of Education in 1947 by Justice Hugo Black. Black wrote that in the words of Jefferson, the clause against establishment of religion by law was intended to erect a wall of separation between church and state. This wall forbids government to actually or effectively favor one religion over another, favor religion over non-religion, and vice versa. Requiring neutrality removes the authority of government from religious practice and protects each citizen's right to express his or her personal beliefs.
Our format calls for a rebuttal, and each side will get an opportunity to rebut. At least the way that's handled in court, that's pretty optional. So at the end of the presentations, what I'm going to do is ask each group whether they would like to rebut. If so, they have the opportunity to do so.
I concur completely with the writings of Justice Black. The question is, how do you interpret that? There's no question that we have a government that is not going to engage in the business of religion. And we have many, many religions in this country that are not going to engage in the business of government. And let me give you a prime example. In 2001, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act was unanimously passed and supported by both parties on both sides of the aisle. Senator Ted Kennedy and, I forget the Republican that authored it, put this up in the Senate. It was passed almost unanimously, and the same thing in the Congress. What was it designed to do? It was designed specifically to keep government from infringing on the rights of the church in the area of zoning. It also included institutionalized persons, which included prisons and mental hospitals, that type of thing. But the problem that they were finding is that churches would go in to build a house of worship, they would go in to put in an addition, they would go in to do something, and they were prohibited from it. Where it all started was in Connecticut, where there was a Bible study going on in someone's house. And it had grown so popular, there's so many cars in the street, that the neighbors were complaining. So the township came in and tried to enforce some zoning ordinance relative to the use of that house for Bible study and parking. Obviously, as a result of that case, there's been a lot of litigation that stemmed from that, but our LUPA came into existence to keep government from interfering with religion. There's a perfect example of separation of church and state, but it enforces, it supports the concept of the free exercise of religion. And that's what we're here talking about today, the free exercise of your beliefs. Not theirs, not mine, not Peg's, but yours, all of us, and the ability to express our opinions on that subject as well.
The other side care to rebut?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there seems to be, just from listening the back and forth, there seems to be some question, some confusion about what the First Amendment means. And just as today, when there's a ruling by the Supreme Court and people aren't clear what a particular justice meant, you look to his writings. And we do the same thing in the past. So when it's written in the Constitution that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, what do they mean by that? You look at the writers, you look at the drafters, and Janice has already said, it's already come up what Thomas Jefferson felt. He said that what this means is, thus these words build a wall of separation between church and state. What did James Madison think? James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution. James Madison said, the number, the industry, and the morality of the priesthood and the devotion of the people have been manifestly increased by the total separation of the church and state. Now, how has that been interpreted by other presidents through time? Millard Fillmore, not the most famous president, but still a thinker, he said, in my view, church and state should be separate, not in form, but in fact. So this is back in 1809, he said that. James Polk, thank God, under our Constitution, there is no connection between church and state. Ulysses S. Grant, keep church and state separate forever. And if anybody's interested, I can give you the quotes, the sources of these. Theodore Roosevelt, I hold that in this country there must be complete severance between church and state. And my favorite, John F. Kennedy, I believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish. And then he goes on to say that we are fortunate to have a separation between church and state. So once again, when you're not sure of what a decision means, you look back to the original writers and see what they intended. Thank you.
Okay, we move on to the second question, and that question is, did our founding fathers intend to establish an absolute separation of church and state when they drafted the Constitution? We'll hear first, in this case, from the folks from Americans United.
Okay, founding fathers and the Constitution, and the question is, did they intend to establish a separation of church and state? If we, as Ed said, look at the writings of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and even George Washington, they were assuring church leaders that our new government was going to have absolute neutrality on matters of religion. The principle of separation of church and state was the most important fundamental bedrock of our citizens' freedom. The first freedom that our founders strove to ensure when they set up our new government was their deeply held belief in religious liberty, which they articulated in the First Amendment. Jefferson swore on the altar of God to protect freedom of conscience. And as a result of Jefferson's personal belief and the beliefs of our founders, a very clear separation between religion and government was enshrined in our nation's founding legal document, which is the United States Constitution. It's very nice for people to think that the Declaration of Independence played a role in establishing the laws that govern this country. That's not exactly true. Our Declaration of Independence was used to declare freedom from England and was used to convince the colonists to get behind support for independence from England. Thomas Jefferson had to convince all of the congressional delegates to get behind the independence of our new country. And Jefferson credited the authority of nature and nature's God to establish liberty and equality. He was using language grounded in both the nature and the divine in order to appeal to the religious and those who were part of the Enlightenment. Jefferson did this to rally their support for independence, and he used the popular language of the day to appeal to everyone from the deists to the devout. We know that our founding fathers fully wanted separation of church and state. That was their intent. They had to unite people from 13 colonies. In each colony, there were different governments. In each government, there were some state churches. There were some state religions. All of these people had to reconcile their differences and come together under one law. And that's the law that was enshrined in the First Amendment to our Constitution.
We'll now have a response from the manager.
It's a well-known fact that the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, which were our first governing instrument, and our Constitution were hotly debated over a lengthy period of time. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have cell phones, so their debates took much longer, particularly when they sometimes had to travel a month or 2 months just to get to Philadelphia, to get to the meetings. So there's no question that this is a hot topic, but they finally came together in unison. And let me read to you from George Washington's farewell address, and let me quote Ben Franklin from his letter to George Washington during the Constitutional Convention. George Washington said in his farewell letter, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports." Supports. Not establish one, support it. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? In other words, when everyone gets in the witness stand, they raise their right hand and they go, "I do swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." And where's their left hand for most people? On a Bible. If you don't believe in a Bible, the courts will take it away. You can swear or affirm as you believe. Benjamin Franklin, not a particularly religious man, great thinker. "I have lived, sir, a long time," and this is his letter to George Washington during the Constitutional Convention. "I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build, they labor in vain that build it." And he goes on to ask that every day during that Constitutional Convention, they open it with prayer, as they did when they were drafting the Declaration of Independence. That's the kind of faith, that's the kind of belief that many, many members of not only the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but of the Constitutional Convention believed in and supported. No, they did not want Congress coming down and saying, you have to be this denomination or this sect, or go to church here or go to church there. What they wanted to be able to exercise their religion freely. But they also knew that faith, divine faith, was the support that every government needs, and that we were specifically and especially blessed with in this country.
Americans United?
I don't have much to say here. I just wanted to clarify, nobody ever doubted or doubts that our founding fathers were religious-leaning people, without question. However, I just want to make clear that none of them would qualify as what we think of Christians today. If you look at their writings, they always talk in very deistic terms, using things like providence, the grand architect. You know, rarely do you hear them mention God. Never do you hear Jesus Christ mentioned. And it is not a stretch to think that a lot of the reference to the Creator in different governmental writings is nothing more than ceremonial deism, and I can talk about that later. Sandra Day O'Connor talked about ceremonial deism quite a bit, whereas these are just casual terms that have become part of government vernacular. So once again, nobody's questioning that the founders were not religious-leaning men. Thank you.
You know, we could quote, they wrote hundreds of letters. I could quote 10 million sentences, and they could quote 10 million sentences, and Mr. Proctor could quote 10 million sentences. That really doesn't help, does it? So maybe a step back will help. When the American colonies were embroiled in their fight for independence from England, if you wanted to hold elected office in England, you had to swear that you believed that the crown was the head of church and state, of all things spiritual, temporal, and ecclesiastical. And if you did it, you couldn't even be a dog catcher. That's the establishment of a state religion. As we've moved through this country, when we look at their practices, the founding fathers attended church. I went back and looked up the religious affiliation of the 39 guys who signed the Constitution. A couple of them were Catholics. That's fairly Christian. They were Episcopalians and Lutherans and Methodists. Those would all be mainstream Protestant. That's fairly Christian. Again, what did they do? They prayed. They brought prayer into. What they said is, you can believe whatever you want, but this is a nation that is founded on the basis that there's an authority higher than the government. There's something above the state. And because there's something above the state, you have unalienable rights. And how you interact with that something, or choose to or not to, is totally your business. The state shouldn't be involved in how you interact with that something. But we as a nation believe that the government isn't top dog. There's something higher. That was really radical. Because in the England in which they were rebelling, King James, for example, said, it's sedition to stand against the crown. If there's not something higher than the state, it's always sedition. There can't be a just cause for revolution unless you can appeal above the state. That's what they were saying, and that's what we're saying.
Okay, move on to the third question, which is, the Declaration of Independence speaks of a creator. In God we trust appears on our currency, and our Pledge of Allegiance speaks of one nation under God. Are these references evidence of a Christian nation? We'll begin with Heritage.
Kind of already answered that. Is this a Christian nation in that everybody in it has to be a Christian? No. Believe whatever you please. Nothing, something, one God, 50 gods. That's up to you. Is this a Christian nation in that you have to believe a certain way in order to hold public office? No. It is not. The Constitution guarantees that. No religious litmus test, different from England, which said you had to belong to the Church of England to hold public office. Is this a nation that began by saying, there is a God and he's a higher authority than the government? Yes. In God We Trust does not just appear on our money. It's our national motto. It's part of our national seal. When they tried to come up with the first national seal, they went to Jefferson and Franklin, who said, you know, we're really not very good artists, but what they wrote was In God We Trust. It's the only national motto we've ever had. It was put on our money back before the Civil War. There's a couple things on the national seal, but In God We Trust is the national motto. This is a nation that says there's limits to government. In a way, this debate's kind of funny. Think about it. Do you know any pastor that has a Christian pastor, a Jewish pastor, a pastor here in America who has an army? Because I don't. You don't have to belong to a church. If you belong, you don't have to attend. If you attend, you don't have to listen. If you listen, you don't have to obey. So why is the government so upset that the church wants to have an active voice in the political process, just like everybody else? Everybody else is allowed to participate. Why would we say that people who want to participate from a faith perspective should not be allowed to talk? Everybody else can. Because just the concept of church says there's an authority higher than the government. And whenever we see across history a move toward tyranny, the first thing that happens is they shut down the voice of anybody who reminds the state that there's somebody above them. Whether it's Hitler, Stalin, Communist China, North Korea, anytime you move toward tyranny, the first voice that gets silenced is the voice of the church, because the government doesn't want you to be reminded that they're not the highest authority. I don't know anybody who wants this to be, everybody has to belong to the same church. I don't think I go to the same church he does, although I don't know, I haven't asked him. I go to the one I want to go to, and I don't really care which one you go to. What we're saying is that the voice of the church has an equal right to participate and be heard, that those folks whose policies and positions are informed from a faith-based perspective have an equal right to participate from a faith-based perspective. And that's really all we're saying. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Americans United.
Depending upon the poll that you look at, a little more than half of all Americans agree with the statement that the United States is a Christian nation, but it's not true. The United States is not a Christian nation legally or constitutionally. It's true, most of our founders did show some religious leanings, but it was very clear from the beginning that they did not want to impose their own religion by law on others. Our civil compact, the Constitution, is a decidedly secular document. It never mentions Christianity, or it never mentions Jesus Christ. Even the word religious is used only once in Article 6 to ban religious tests for public office. 2 years after the signing of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights starts off with, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This language should dispel any lingering doubt about whether America was intended to be a Christian nation. Today, no one can deny that Americans are a very religious people. Again, depending on the poll, about 75% of Americans say that they are Christian. So yes, demographically speaking, we may be Christian, but we do not have anything approaching a Christian theocracy. We have a constitutional democracy in which all religious beliefs are protected. As a result, we are a nation of Christians sociologically because we are not a Christian nation constitutionally. Religious right groups insist that the United States was designed to be officially Christian and that our laws should enforce the doctrines of their version of Christianity. Is this point accurate? Is there anything in the Constitution that gives special treatment or preference to Christianity? The answer is no. I want to make clear that it's not that our founding fathers did not dislike religion. However, they were well aware of the dangers of church-state union. Many were believers, like I said previously. However, they always spoke in deistic terms. You never heard them say Jesus, rarely God. It was always Providence, the grand architect, the author of all. Under the administration of John Adams, the Treaty of Tripoli was approved unanimously by the Senate in 1797. Article 11 of the treaty states, the government of the United States is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. A unanimous decision by the Senate. Had an officially Christian nation been the goal of the founders, it would have been very easy to state, and the concept would appear in our Constitution. It doesn't. Instead, our nation's governing document ensures religious freedom for everyone.
I don't think at any time today, and I don't think at any time in Mrs. Luxick's career in defending her beliefs, and I know nowhere in mine, have I ever suggested that our government be Christian, or Muslim, or Buddhist, or Jewish, or anything else. I believe that our government should be governed, and it is. If you were to poll all the leaders in Congress today, you'd find a wide diversity of religions in the halls of Congress and the Senate today. But has government stayed out of religion? No. I'm going to give you a very specific example. How many of you are familiar with the prohibition against 501c3 organizations, that is churches, to espouse their religious beliefs from the pulpit? One hand. Lyndon Johnson, when he was running for re-election in the early 50s, was opposed by a religious group, and so in the middle of the night, he introduced legislation that gave enabling powers to the IRS to restrict preachers from saying what they felt about politics from the pulpit. The only way they can do it today is if they invite the Republican, the Democrat, and the Libertarian all at the same time to get up and speak. But the pastor himself cannot. In his own home he can. Now what does that sound like to you? Does that sound like restriction on the freedom of speech? That whether you're Jewish or Presbyterian or any other religion, you can't speak from the pulpit what you believe about a political issue without losing your 501c3 status, that's your tax-exempt status? That's the government infringing on religious freedom. That's the government telling you what you can or can't do. And if you have a political issue that a church, and I don't care what church it is, believes in, they should be able to express their opinion on it. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry some people are leaving right now because I am completely dumbfounded by what I just heard. We just heard some absolute falsehoods concerning our nation's founding, concerning our nation's national motto. It was just alleged that our nation's only national motto had been one nation under God. I'm sure you guys all took history and learned that our nation's first national motto was E pluribus unum. So it is false to assert that it was not that. You know, it's almost weird to be debating church-state separation because what is the alternative to church-state separation? It's a state religion. And what religion are we going to use? The majority religion? Are you guys all part of the same majority religion as each other? I don't think so. But you know, the concept of a Christian nation is one of the biggest language-based myths that separationists like we and Ed have to debunk on a routine basis. It was noted that just because there's a majority of Christians in this nation, that doesn't make us a Christian nation. Just because there's a majority of white people in this nation doesn't mean that this is a white nation. Our founding fathers went out of their way to make sure that there was no language specific to any religion in our founding documents, other than to state in the Constitution that there was no religious test for office. Some people like to say that our nation was founded on Christian principles. Let me tell you some Christian principles. Jesus Christ was the Holy Son of God who was crucified, died for our sins, and whose resurrection leads to eternal salvation. That's not in the Constitution. Okay? Another Christian principle is the Holy Trinity. That's not in the Constitution. Another Christian principle is the virgin birth. Those are Christian principles. The idea that Christians own certain morality, that they own do not murder, do not steal, do not lie, is completely false. If you examine other religions, examine other governments throughout history, you will find that that is false. Thank you.
We proceed to the fourth question. What impact do the Ten Commandments have on the U.S. legal system? And should local governments be permitted to display them outside of their courthouses? We will start with Americans United.
Thank you.
By the way, churches can express political opinions anytime they want, except churches have accepted that they want the 501c designation. If they said that we don't want the tax break, then churches can say what they want. So in order to qualify, they have to, just regarding the 501c issue. Ten Commandments. The primary problem with this claim that the Ten Commandments are the basis of our laws is that the facts simply don't support that. To the contrary, legal scholars everywhere agree that there are many sources for American law. Even a quick reading of the Ten Commandments shows how difficult it would be to claim that American law derives from them. The first 4 commandments deal with God, saying that we shouldn't honor false gods, shouldn't take his name in vain, and we should honor the Sabbath. If the first 4 commandments were enacted into law today, they would constitute clear constitutional violations because they're telling us how to practice our religion. It's an exceedingly strained argument to say that the Ten Commandments are the source of our laws when the first 4 prove that the commandments are religious in nature, not civil. So as a starting point, only the latter 6 could possibly be nominees for sources of our laws. 2 of those 6 can be immediately ruled out. Number 5, honor one's father and mother, is not a legal rule, it's a moral imperative. So is number 7, the prohibition on cheating on one's spouse. If tested by the Supreme Court, a criminal prohibition against adultery would likely be struck down as unconstitutional. Similarly, the 10th Commandment's a ban on coveting thy neighbor's wife might play a role in a divorce proceeding, but not a civil case. That leaves Commandments 6, 8, and 9. They command us not to kill, steal, or lie. And even these aren't reflected in our laws. Granted, the ban on lying does appear as a legal rule in some contexts. For instance, misrepresentation can be a basis for fraud. But many lies are not legally regulated, like telling your best friend that you like their hairdo when you really don't is not a basis for a legal action. That leaves us with only 2 commandments that are somewhat accurately echoed in current law: the rule against murder and the rule against stealing. And even the rule against murder is not exactly the same as a commandment, right? We recognize exceptions: self-defense, capital punishment. The 6th commandment simply does not recognize these exceptions. Furthermore, the origin of the 10 Commandments is not unique. These common sense dictates are found widespread among human cultures and are not distinctively Christian. No one would argue that any nation prohibiting such actions must therefore be Christian.
Time for response from Meredith.
I wasted time on that 5
I find it interesting that in this debate, Mrs. Rail brought up some of the theological components of our faith, of the Christian faith. I don't recall any congressman, senator, or president trying to get them adopted into law either through legislation or amendment to the Constitution. I don't recall any congressman or senator trying to get the 10 Commandments added to as an amendment to the Constitution. And the 10 Commandments, if you really want to look at it from the historical perspective that I brought up earlier, are Jewish in nature. Moses brought them down from Mount Sinai, not Jesus. So they are Jewish in origin. And the fact that they outline a way of life and I'm being polite there, a way of life, a way that they believe you should live, what's wrong with that? If our side of the podium here, we're saying all these things, the theological things that Mrs. Rail brought up, and the Ten Commandments should be incorporated into our legislation and our Constitution, I think they'd have a point. But the fact of the matter is, we do have laws against perjury. We do have laws against defamation. We do have laws against stealing. We do have laws against murder. We do have laws against multiple wives. Adultery is a personal thing. But the fact that somebody posted the Ten Commandments in a public place and someone says they're offended by it, well, they don't have to read it. The only way that they're going to be offended by it is if they walk up to the wall where it's posted and they read it. And because they don't believe in it. And that's their choice. It's just like their choice to smoke or not smoke, to drink or not drink, to go down to the casino or not go down to the casino. It's the exact same thing. They all have a choice. And that's what we're here talking about today, our choices. Our choice to follow the Constitution as it was written in a very historic time, to follow the guidelines that were set out and the enabling nature of the Constitution, or to ignore it. To have judicial activism where a judge says, well, I'm going to take a private letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote and I'm going to change the Constitution. Or because I feel a certain way about a topic, a moral or ethical topic, we're going to pass legislation to make people feel better. That's not what the Constitution's about. That's why the Constitution is simple and it's clear. Congress shall not establish a religion. Nowhere have myself or Mrs. Luchik said we want to establish Christianity or any other religion as a formal part of our state or federal government. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to think that my opponent has never seen anyone trying to legislate the Ten Commandments, because we have a solid separation of church and state in this country that we benefit from, so that the Ten Commandments and other religious dogma cannot be forced upon all of us who are not part of that faith. Opponents of church-state separation like to tell people that the displays of the Ten Commandments on government property is okay because it's the foundation of American or Western law. That's simply not true. Our laws are based in principles of democracy and freedom that come from our ancient Greco-Roman culture, comes from England's charter, the Magna Carta, which comes from 1218, I think. As Ed said previously, legal prohibitions against theft and murder exist outside the Ten Commandments, exist in all cultures, in almost all laws. The only things the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, has in common with U.S. law is the prohibition against theft and murder. The idea that our laws come from commands from God is a theological proposition. It's perfectly okay to believe that in your heart. It is not okay to try to legislate it. And I would like to think that due to our church-state separation history in America, that we're very fortunate that people who oppose separation, who can only be called theocrats if they don't want a secular government, those people want to legislate their beliefs on all of us. And the Ten Commandments and the displays are unconstitutional. And Americans United has held that in many court cases. We haven't been successful in all of them. We've had some out-of-court successes. Ten Commandments displays that are historical are allowed to remain where they are. New Ten Commandments displays are not allowed to be put up. It is very difficult for someone to put up a new Ten Commandments display. Roy Moore had to take his down in Alabama and put it on the back of a truck and drive it around the country just so people could see it. My time's up.
I'm going to go back a bit and then I'm going to go forward. You know, there's a big flap about the national motto since somebody just called me a liar. I thought I'd just clarify. And was it e pluribus unum? No. The only motto that Congress has ever recognized is "In God We Trust." And I was kind of curious, I went back and looked it up when the big flap happened, because I thought, oh, wasn't it e pluribus unum? E pluribus unum is on the front of the national seal. And when Congress authorized "In God We Trust" as the only national motto that Congress has ever authorized, they said, some people are using that and that's okay. But this is the one we authorize. So just as a clarification. New displays of the Ten Commandments are not allowed. But historical ones, ones who were there when the Founding Fathers, the ones who wrote the documents, they're historical, so they're allowed because the guys who wrote the documents thought it was okay to display the Ten Commandments. That's why it's like in the Supreme Court. So the guys who wrote the documents didn't have a problem with displaying the Ten Commandments, but since we've reinterpreted, now we have a problem. New ones aren't allowed. But the guys who wrote the documents that we say they didn't like it, they did display it because they're all there. That's what's called a circular or a contradictory argument, because you just contradicted yourself. The guys who wrote it said it was okay because they're all there. Now that we've reinterpreted, well, the new ones aren't allowed. If you go to the Supreme Court and you look at the walls, you're going to find the Ten Commandments. So the guys who wrote it thought it was okay. Obviously, they didn't have a problem then.
Because of time considerations, this question, our fifth question, will be the last today. And the question is, should public schools include intelligent design as an alternative theory to evolution in their science classrooms? We'll begin with Heritage.
Classes in science should be open to scientific inquiry. Let's separate what's religion and what's science. What's religion? Who is God? What's my relationship to him? Do I believe in one? Do I believe in a bunch? Do I believe in none? That's religion. Science. What does the historical, what does the record tell us? Any question, therefore, should be allowed. That's science. So if we are looking at the origin of anything on the planet, since we weren't there and didn't see it, we should be allowed, and in an appropriate scientific inquiry, any questions should be allowed. Questions like, how many people have ever heard of Sir Isaac Newton? Did you ever hear of Isaac Newton? You ever hear of the 3 laws of thermodynamics? What's the second law? It's called the entropy law. If you ever saw Jurassic Park, the entropy law. Any system left to itself over time will devolve into simpler parts and eventually turn into chaos. Evolution. Any system by random chance evolved into more complex parts and moved from chaos to order. The second law of thermodynamics says order will devolve into chaos. Evolution says chaos evolved into order. How did they fit together? And why aren't I allowed to ask that question? That has nothing to do with a theological perspective. That's called scientific inquiry. Now, maybe there's a good answer. I've yet to hear one, but maybe there is one. And I've had this conversation with scientists all over. When you look at what should be taught in a science class, scientific inquiry and questioning should not only be allowed, but encouraged. Which means we don't just say, well, you're only allowed to believe in this. That, my friends, is actually faith. And this is science, not religion. So you should be allowed to ask any question you want. And you should be allowed and encouraged to question the fossil record. You should be allowed and encouraged to question the evidence to see how any philosophy or theory fits in with what else we know about science. That's called scientific inquiry. It should be encouraged at every level, whether it's evolution or any of the other theories out there. They should be presented and the kids should be encouraged to question them, because that's called science.
The laws of thermodynamics apply only to physical systems, not biologic systems. That's the answer to our question.
Yeah.
Religious conservatives keep coming up with different schemes to get Bible-based science into the classroom, and they keep getting denied. After a failed attempt, failed attempts at getting creationism into the classroom, the strategy changed, and they began to promote intelligent design, which says essentially that the universe is too complex to be explained by natural forces, and therefore you have to invoke a creator. Just 5 years ago, right here in Pennsylvania, the Dover School Board decided that evolution was not a viable theory, and they instructed their biology teachers to teach the alternative. The alternative was intelligent design. Parents sued, and the case went to court. The presiding federal judge at the Dover trial, Judge John E. Jones, who, by the way, was a George W. Bush appointee, had this to say at the end of the case. Intelligent design presents students with a religious alternative masquerading as a scientific theory. This is a federal judge now. It directs them to consult a creationist text as though it was science, and instructs students to forego scientific inquiry in the public classroom and instead to seek out religious instruction. In the wake of unsuccessful attempts at getting intelligent design accepted, proponents have taken a new tack. They now advocate that evolution is a theory in crisis, that our schools should be teaching the controversy. Creationists argue for a crisis because they claim that the details of evolution remain unknown and that evolutionists are always debating the point. It's fair to say that not all the details of evolution will ever be understood, and that each step in the progress of evolution invariably leads to more questions. This is not indicative of a theory in crisis. Rather, it's affirmation of a healthy debate that occurs in any scientific field when ideas are freely exchanged. I want to emphasize that the evolution debate is not just an academic matter. When you think about it, we have the technical progress of our country at stake. If we as a society had chose to ignore evolution, as religious fundamentalists would like us to do, we would not have the genetic knowledge to understand bacterial infections, HIV, Huntington's disease, and the list goes on. Similarly, in agriculture, pest control, disease resistance, genetic diversity, all have their roots in evolution theory. Finding hydrocarbons in the subsurface is directly linked to understanding the fossil record, the evolution record. What is most troubling about their efforts to get their beliefs accepted as science, religious fundamentalists argue that what they are offering is an alternative scientific theory, which is simply not the case.
How many of you in here are engineers? Anybody? There we got one. How many of you are IT? A little bit, okay. Let me ask you a question, real simple question. Does anyone in this room know of a pump that will work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for the next 75 years without maintenance? Do you?
Sodium potassium pump in your body.
Oh, okay, that's exactly where I'm going. Does anyone here know of a computer that will work day and night for the next 75 years? Or a pancreas, or a kidney, or any other organ in the human body? We can't make one. We can't devise one. The best we can do if someone has kidney failure is put them on a kidney dialysis machine for a few hours to try to clean out their bloodstream, and then we've got to go and do maintenance on that dialysis machine. Same thing when somebody has open heart surgery. That heart pump will only work during the time that the surgeon's operating. They've tried external hearts and what have you. We can't make one. Now, to tell me that even though there's a few gaps in evolution, as my opponent has just conceded, even though there's a few gaps in evolution that we'll never understand, that somehow from the basic elements in the universe, that a bolt of lightning hit one of them and created an amoeba, which then decided to divide. We all have biology. What is it? The replication process of the self-division of cells. And that division of cells led into the complex human beings that we are. If any of you are medical students, just go and study the difference between a man and a woman. And I'm not talking sex organs. A woman's shoulder is different than a man's. A woman's hip is different than a man's. It's not good or bad, it's not right or wrong, it's just that they're different. How did that happen? How did that happen that personalities of men and women are different? That what goes on in the brain between men and women is different? And the same thing with animals. This is, time's up. Thank you.
Okay, I thought he was supposed to talk about intelligent design. I don't know what was just said. I'd like to talk about intelligent design because I know that intelligent design is a theological assertion that is also known as creationism. Creationism was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court in 1987 in the Edwards versus Aguilar case. It was ruled that that the belief in a supernatural creator being responsible for the creation of humankind is a religious viewpoint and cannot be taught in public schools along with the scientific theory of evolution. Intelligent design is not science. It is a critique of science that is completely outside of science. There is no debate within science. There is no controversy that has to do with actual scientists doing actual science. We know that intelligent design is intended to preach religion because we have this really cool document written by an intelligent design group. It's called the Wedge document. The purpose of the Wedge document is to defeat scientific materialism and its destructive moral, cultural, and political legacies. It's to replace materialistic explanations with the theistic understandings that nature and human beings are created by God. The only purpose of intelligent design is to preach religion in schools. It has no actual scientific foundation. It has no business being taught in public schools. And it is really, we could talk about this one all night. I wish we had more time so I could go over this a little more. But intelligent design is a religious belief. You're entitled to believe that. It's not even a mainstream belief. I mean, most Christians don't believe in a literal interpretation of Genesis. Most people don't believe that everything got zapped here magically in 6 days and it was just nothing evolved ever. That's simply outside of science. We know this through rigorous and robust scientific inquiry. Thank you all for having me.
The close of the formal debate portion of this session, but we said at the outset that we try to leave some time for questions from the audience. I know we're running a little late, but if anybody has a couple of questions, I'd be happy to field them. Yes, sir.
If I can have a quick aside before I get into my question. There's a wonderful book that was released a couple years ago that describes many evolution arguments for and their arguments against them. It's called The Greatest Show on Earth by Professor Dawkins. It is a fantastic read. I highly recommend it even if you don't believe in evolution because it describes many of the arguments and may even give you arguments against those arguments. My question is to the Heritage Foundation and that group. You talk about how the Supreme Court has no right to alter the Constitution, has no right to change the way federal government goes on a whim, to paraphrase. I'd like to bring up, Madison versus Marbury, I believe it's
Marbury versus
Madison, thank you. And the Supreme Court idea of judicial review brought on by the Chief Justice. Would you not agree that judicial review has played an important role in the American legal system and the American government as a whole, or if not, why not?
I would agree with that completely, that judicial review is an important aspect of our system. However, you have to understand that we have the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branches of government. And the idea of checks and balances was one to keep eye on the other. If one had more power than the other, for example, the executive branch, then the checks and balances, we would end up like in other countries that are, I don't want to mention any country specifically, but we've seen recently in the news countries where someone's been running roughshod over their people. We don't want that, so we have the checks and balances. But in the Constitution itself, it provides for a Supreme Court and the number of justices and what their job is, and how, as I said earlier, whether you want to amend or repeal a section of the Constitution, how it's done. It has to originate in the Congress, and then it has to go to the states to be ratified. It does not require the approval of the president, other than that he signs the bill, and it does not require the approval of the Supreme Court. Now, if somebody brings a challenge, and this is the interesting part, so many people think that the Supreme Court, of their own initiative, goes out and tests these cases. No, it's if someone brings it to them, and if they deem it, they don't take every case. Trust me, Professor will tell you as well. They don't take 1/100th of the, or 1/1000th of the cases that get there. They pick the ones, particularly, that they think are worthy of review. And that's their job, is to review them and to see if a law fits the Constitution and fits what our founding fathers said. So I'm not against judicial review, but when the Supreme Court comes out and they say something that is contrary to what the Constitution says, that I do have a problem.
Yes.
For Delaware Valley Union. I was wondering if, in your opinion of complete separation of church and state, hypothetically, if churches did not receive government funding, would they be allowed to deny any persons from joining that church, including LGBT individuals?
Absolutely, it would be within their rights fully. And that's kind of the idea of church-state separation, is that it protects religious autonomy, it protects churches and lets them be as bigoted and hateful as they want. It lets them say things like God's hate fags. It lets them do things that some people might object to, because we have this separation of church and state. Churches are allowed to do the things they want. And if churches began to receive more government funding, and if that government funding went to their religious operations and their religious ministries, the government could have a say in how those churches operate. The separation is not anti-religion. It is just government neutrality on religion. Neutrality is not hostility. We don't want to interfere with anyone's right to believe what they want, to follow their freedom of conscience, to worship how they want, but we do want to keep that out of the government. It has no place in government. Our secular tradition is very long, and as a group, Americans United for Separation of Church and State represents people of all faith traditions. We respect everyone's faith tradition. We want everyone to practice their religion as they see fit. They just can't legislate it.
And the reason I asked that is it seems like funding is left out of the discourse when discussing separation of church and state issues.
We could have a whole, you guys could have me back, we'll talk about faith-based funding. Give me 2 hours all by myself.
In the back.
I have a question for the heritage side. You both mentioned that an important thing with separation of church and state is that individuals can believe what they want and then act on those beliefs. Do you think that also applies to gay people who want to get married and women who want to have abortions, or only people who believe what you believe?
You lumped a whole bunch of things in this same category. I think however you want to live is none of my business. Marriage is a license, and that's a whole different area than a right. You have a right to live with whoever you want. You can live with your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your aunt, your uncle, your dog, your cat, your neighbor. I don't care who you live with, that's totally up to you. A marriage license is a whole different thing than your right to live with whoever you want. And I don't really care who you live with. So when we talk about separation, that would be none of my business. And I don't go around asking people those kind of questions. When we talk about what is legal and what is not legal, and when you bring up abortion, I define that as there's a person who has an equal right to live, no matter how little they are or where they happen to be. So I think, yes, everyone has an equal right to live, and no one should be allowed to impose their belief on someone who is littler or less able to defend themselves than another. And that would be a legal right. It sometimes depends on like framing the issue. I have 5 sons and a daughter. My boys were never girls, and I've never been a boy. They were different sex from me from the moment of conception. They were just as much of a right to live as I did.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Mrs. Lupsick and Mr. Proctor, James McGonigal. What is God? And who speaks for God?
That would be a question you would have to answer for yourself.
So I can tell you that there is no such thing, and that I speak for the Constitution. I keep it alive. Therefore, I feel that your points are groundless. That's what God feels. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGonigal. We
You're
respect
welcome.
your opinion. Way in the back corner.
Thank you. This is for the lady. I'm guessing your involvement in the church and state. My question is, you were talking about how you thought that, that people with religion, all they want is an equal voice in government, just like everyone else. But I see that people are allowed to vote no matter what their religion is, or if you even have one. So I'm kind of curious as to what exactly you want. And I just don't understand.
If I am a nonprofit organization, I have rights to tell my membership. My daughter is a ballerina. She lives in Madison, Wisconsin. They've just had a huge, I'm sure you've seen it, it's been in the news. I guess they're still in the news. It's, huge battle over budget fights and all kinds of issues. And many organizations brought together interest groups to protest the actions of the governor. I don't know all the interest groups that were there. I support every one of them having the right to do that. But if you were a church, you wouldn't have the right to do that. A church, a pastor, cannot stand inside a pulpit, two members of his own congregation who are there voluntarily, and say, it is a moral issue, whatever the issue is, and if you go across this country, every church would have a different position. And as a pastor, I feel it is my not just right but duty to give you advice in informing your conscience and how to participate politically. Anybody else can stand up and do that. The argument is given that, well, since churches have 501c3 status, therefore they're getting some support from the government, so they should not be allowed to participate in the political process. If you accept that argument, then every senior citizen who gets Social Security, every college student who gets a Pell Grant, everyone who receives Medicaid, everyone who receives FIA, anyone who receives a government contract is also getting support from the government and shouldn't be allowed to participate. But everybody is, except a church, and that shouldn't be allowed. When we talk about what actually is disallowed in schools, every point of view is allowed except one that is based on a biblical perspective. Now, I'm not an evangelical Protestant, so I wouldn't agree with many of the things that those who are from that perspective might say. I still think they have a right to say it. That's my issue, is that when we talk about the speech that's not allowed, pastors are told they're not allowed to speak in their own pulpits to their own congregations. And that is not right. Now, there are, and it's interesting because I've recently been involved with some legal issues in that matter, working with congressmen and some folks. I have a son in the Navy, and there's some issues about Navy chaplains being told that they can't say certain things. And again, you don't have to attend that church. So I don't care what you believe, but I think that everybody should have an equal right to participate in the public marketplace of ideas. And ideas shouldn't be denigrated, and the people who believe them shouldn't be denigrated. It is not helpful to discourse or dialogue to call people religious fundamentalists, to call people hateful. None of those things are helpful to dialogue. They all happened here tonight, but none of them happened from this side of the aisle. So it's kind of interesting when we talk about dialogue. Listen to the words and the terms that are used. That's part of the problem. That there's an immediate second classing if you believe from a biblical perspective, and that's sad.
Okay, we'll do one last question.
I'm a science student at the University of the Sciences, and I'm open to the idea of God. I don't believe for or against. And in my school, they do teach in some classes the teleological proof, and I don't have a problem with that. I think that's a great thing. But my question is, science is based on the idea that you can observe something, that you can reproduce something experimentally, and based on that, if you can't observe a God, or if you cannot, in a sense, do some sort of experiment to prove God, would you say that would you say that God necessarily belongs in a biology classroom, or instead would it belong in, let's say, a philosophy classroom or some other type of? So what I'm saying is, do you still think, even after it doesn't not follow the fundamental rules of science, and that you cannot set up an experiment to observe God, then, similarly, because I can prove that a human can fly, if it was written in a text somewhere long ago that a man did fly, is that evidence that a person can actually fly? So that's kind of what I'm trying to ask my question.
But there are many things, I think, in science. For example, you cannot in a laboratory produce life from non-life. So how did it happen? There are many things that we assume, and there are some things that I think it is not unscientific to say it's not in the purview of science. You can't have an experiment to prove love, but everybody here would, I think, agree it exists. It's just beyond science. There are certain things that I think are within the purview of observable science, and certain things that are not. And a science class should be open to questions all the way around.
Let me give you a little anecdote that you're all much younger than myself, and I'm giving away my age. But when I was in school, not only did we say the Pledge of Allegiance, but we read from the Bible every day, and we prayed every day until Madeline Murray O'Hare brought her case and had prayer and Bible reading taken out of the public schools.
It's not true either. It's simply not true.
Well,
Valerie
excuse
Shep.
me. I didn't interrupt you, number
Sorry.
one, and number two, I haven't called you a liar today. Okay, so I'd appreciate it if
Okay.
if the question were posed to you. So we have a situation where, in the last 40, 50 years, all of a sudden, the heritage, the training, the knowledge that's available, not just from the Bible, but from many other readings that support the Bible and other theologies, are not available to you students. How many of you have gone out on your own and studied the religions in a deep sense, in the sense of really studying and finding out what it is to be Jewish or Roman Catholic or Protestant or Muslim? Excellent, excellent. But there was only 3, 4 hands over here and 1 over here in this whole room.
You said you only read the Bible. So did you do that in school too? You said you read the Bible every day.
Yes.
And other
Yes, and other books as well. And based on that, and based on reading and answering this young man's question, there are many tremendous scholars who were atheists, like Mr. McGonigal here, or non-believers, I should say. I don't know.
Atheist is fine, thank you.
Okay, non-believers who went to disprove the Bible, and after reading it and studying supporting documents, became believers. And I'm not here to promote my religion. I'm just saying that that's what happened. I'm sure there's many people who went out and read the Quran and became believers in Muslim, or Hinduism, or some other religion. But it requires that study, and we've taken that opportunity away in this country.
Oh, but I'm not saying, excuse me, but I'm not saying taking religion completely out of schools, because I think it does have a place in school. You need to learn about different beliefs, and it's an integral part of one's, education. But should it be in a science course where science is based on proving things? And actually, to answer your question, I don't believe they have created life in a laboratory, but they've, in a laboratory, created the fundamental structures of life and amino acids, for example.
Right, but they have never been able to make the jump.
Yeah, but
And all I'm
life
saying
is
is
such
it's not observable.
life's an arbitrary,
But all I'm saying
that's
is he
completely
said
ar-
everything in science is observable. My
No,
only
but
thing is that's not observable.
what the gentleman is saying is that you're able to create
As is too often the
organic
case.
compounds.
Great debate, great debate.
You guys are well prepared. Well prepared. That's right. That's right.
I love Ellery Schiff, but he needs the credit, not Marilyn.
Nice job, hey, thank you.